In this week's edition of Climate Friday newsletter, we're going to be talking the tropics. This is something we have discussed all week long in tracking Hurricane Ian. And right behind me, you can see a satellite loop. This is from Wednesday evening, showing you the landfall on the Gulf Coast of Florida and the subsequent weakening of Ian as it moved to the northeast. Now, this is just one of many powerful hurricanes classified as that major hurricane status that we are going to discuss. But does climate change play a role in tropical cyclones? And what are the specific mechanisms that cause an uptick and an intensification of hurricanes and tropical storms? We're going to be discussing that in this week's Climate Friday newsletter. And if you're watching this on YouTube or you haven't already subscribed, you can head to WTOL.com/email to subscribe for the very latest information every single Friday. And right in your inbox, you'll get that climate change information and how it may impact you, both the weather here at home and across the country. So as far as climate change and hurricanes go, there are several specific impacts and several mechanisms that we're going to discuss today. First and foremost, this is something we saw with Hurricane Ian, but rapid intensification. In other words, when a hurricane or a tropical storm intensifies and increases very quickly, this usually results in a raise in the category, and also that pressure becomes even deeper and lower, indicative of rapid intensification. Number two is sea level rise. This is something that scientists have been discussing for decades, but it impacts how folks feel the effects of these tropical cyclones, and also how high the water can rise. And this storm surge in particular is one of the effects of sea level rise, and also slower movement. How does the movement of tropical cyclones, or the trajectory, change, and what effect does that have on the impacts? We're going to discuss all of those and more. Here are four of the main mechanisms that we're going to talk about when we speak of hurricanes and climate change. Rapid intensification is the first and foremost, because the stronger a hurricane is, generally speaking, that's going to equate to more rain, higher storm surge, and also gustier winds. And we saw that with Hurricane Ian, where it strengthened to a high-end Category 4 over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And rapid intensification leads to worse hurricanes. More evaporation is another important point to talk about with climate change. It's no secret that the oceans and the lakes are warmer than they were decades ago. One way to think of it, let's just say you're boiling a pot of water. You turn that stovetop on low. It's going to boil, but it's still going to take a while, right? Now, if you turn it up to medium, it's going to boil a little bit faster. And what if you crank that heat up to high? That is going to cause the water to boil rather quickly. That's what we're dealing with in today's climate. Greater evaporation due to warmer temperatures and warmer sea surface temperatures. In other words, when the Gulf of Mexico is warmer, that causes more evaporation, more moisture, and more fuel. In other words, we have the metaphorical stovetop turned to high, and that is causing increased evaporation, or in this metaphor, boiling. Also, sea level rise, that is one of the biggest impacts on storm surge, and storm surge has gotten worse over the recent decades. And last but not least, the track of these hurricanes and tropical cyclones, the movement in general has gotten slower, and I'm going to break down the specifics and quantify that coming up in just a couple minutes. First impact, rapid intensification, something that did occur with Hurricane Ian. The warmer ocean waters are fuel for the fire, and that strengthens cyclones. When the Gulf of Mexico is 80 to 85 degrees, that provides ample fuel and moisture for rapid intensification. Hurricanes over cooler waters tend to lose steam and lose strength, and hurricanes over land, they encounter friction from objects over the land and weaken as well. Warm, open ocean waters, that causes rapid intensification and an uptick in hurricane strength. Second impact, more evaporation. As I mentioned, not only are the sea surface temperatures warmer, but air temperatures are warmer as well. And in fact, even in Toledo here, we've warmed several degrees since the last 50 years. Since 1970, we're over 3 degrees warmer, and that's a trend that is occurring not just in the Midwest, but also down south where hurricanes occur. Heavier rainfall causes greater storm surge, and the inundation of water leads to flooding that impacts businesses, homes, and unfortunately causes fatalities as well. Here is the mechanism by which we see that increase in rainfall. For every 1 degree of warming, we see a 4% increase in moisture. In other words, if we've warmed 3 degrees in the last 50 years, that is a 12% increase in available moisture, and more moisture leads to heavier tropical rainfall. That is a pattern that is going to continue into the future, and climate change is going to cause heavier rain out of systems in the future. So let's talk about a couple recent tropical cyclones that really dosed out a ton of rainfall. The one that may come to your mind in recent memory, that is Harvey. Harvey occurred in 2017 in Texas, and it was the type of storm that moved so slowly. It continually dumped rain, and it seemed like it took forever to let up. That is evidenced by the 60 inches of rainfall. It is hard to even fathom that amount of rain, but over 5 feet of rain fell due to the impacts of Harvey. Florence is another one that may come to mind. Now, that was not a Gulf of Mexico cyclone, but rather North Carolina saw nearly 3 feet of rainfall, 35-inch reports coming from Florence in 2018. And Imelda is another recent tropical cyclone that again impacted Texas, dumping 44 inches of rain. Of course, there are a number of other impactful tropical cyclones that dropped a lot of rain, but these are recent ones as well. Now, we always reiterate this, and it's important to note that climate change isn't the only factor that causes this heavy rain. 50 to 100 years ago, there were hurricanes that dropped a lot of rain, and there always will be. That's just a natural part of Mother Nature. However, these intense rainfall totals are made worse by climate change due to the increased moisture. Let's talk about another mechanism, sea level rise. That is something that has especially impacted coastal cities. Florida comes to mind, but also even some coastal New England cities and parts of California. There has been talk about these cities potentially someday becoming uninhabitable. I know it's a very long road to that, and we don't want to hype up the weather, especially climate change, but we want to talk reasonably about the impacts of sea level rise. Not necessarily an instantaneous effect that you feel overnight, but this is something that occurs over many, many decades. Coastal flooding has gotten worse, and more damaging storm surge is another trend due to sea level rise. Because of sea level rise, storm surge is worse. Let's just say the water is 1 to 2 feet higher than it was a few decades ago. That means the areas that used to never flood are becoming flood prone, and that is going to continue to grow worse in the future. In other words, even if you live in a part of Florida or Texas that doesn't typically flood in these systems, it likely will a few decades from now. And last but not least, an impact that might surprise you, slower movement. Tropical cyclones are not as fast moving as they were years ago, and that causes a number of issues. The impacts, they last a lot longer, as we saw with Harvey. That was a system that several days in the making just kept dumping rain, and it led to increased flooding. This is what we call the training or very slow moving storm systems, where they continually dump rain band after rain band after rain band, and it just does not seem to let up. And this slower movement is growing worse in the future. There was actually a scientific research paper that analyzed the movement of tropical cyclones across the globe, and it analyzed the 1949 to 2016 time frame. So essentially comparing how it is now to how it was back mid-century in 1949. And as a whole, tropical cyclones, that includes hurricanes and tropical storms, they move 10% slower. Now, there's a couple different reasons for that. Overall, the large-scale weather patterns, they move at a different rate, and this can impact the mid-latitude cyclones or the low-pressure storms that we feel here at home. It can impact winter storms, and it has an effect on tropical storms as well. But a 10% slowdown in movement, what that does is it causes the rainfall to be worse, it causes the storm surge to be more persistent, and those same areas get barreled on by these impacts day after day. Here are a few systems in recent decades that brought Category 4 or Category 5 impacts to parts of the Gulf Coast, just to go over how serious some of these recent hurricanes have been. Of course, there's Ian, 150-mile-an-hour winds when it made landfall this week. Irma in 2017, that is another recent one that comes to mind with 130-mile-an-hour winds. Ida packed a punch, same wind speeds as Ian. Michael was 160 miles an hour on the panhandle of Florida. Laura, 150, that is just to the west of New Orleans and east of Texas. And of course, Harvey, the winds were only 130 miles an hour, but it is that slow moving rain and thunderstorm activity that really caused problems. And just to give you one last example of the uptick in damage and impacts of tropical cyclones, looking back on the 2021 hurricane season, especially Ida, that was the most impactful. $70 billion in damage. It's one thing to talk about the science behind it and to analyze the storm surge and the winds and all of the weather data, but the financial burden and unfortunately the impact to human life, that is something that is really sad and is a change that climate change has caused. That's this week's Climate Friday newsletter, talking about tropical cyclones and hurricanes and how climate change plays a role. You can head to the WTOL 11 YouTube channel for more videos, and also to subscribe to get these to your inbox. Head to WTOL.com/email, and we have new content coming your way every Friday.